Hello, everyone. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Communications for PFLAG National. As always, to host these conversations, I'd like to welcome my good friend and colleague, our Director of Learning and Inclusion, Jean Marie Nevada.
Liz Owen, how are you?
I am. It's so much easier to say Liz Owen than it is Jean Marie Nevada, but I did it. There you go.
I'm so excited today because I'm having a huge, exciting nerd day because of today's topic, which is one of my favorites.
And not just the topic, but I witnessed you welcome our guests in the green room, and there was some severe nerding going on. So I'm sorry that I outed you in that way, but
I think people have figured it out by now.
That you're a super nerd. Well, I won't keep you from them anymore. Have a wonderful conversation.
We will see you on the other side, Liz. Thank you. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. My pronouns are she and Ahia. And every single week, we get to talk about something related to LGBTQ equality and inclusion. And this week, we are talking about one of my very favorite topics in the whole world, which is talking about LGBTQ history. So the article that we are using this week, you can access on our website at straightforequality.org/discussion series. It appeared in The Advocate. And it was entitled The LGBTQ History Exhibit That Unfortunately Made History. And it was written, interestingly enough, by Rodney Wilson, who, in a little bit of our own history trivia, was the educator who is credited with starting LGBTQ History Month. And as I said, we have two incredible guests today who I'm so beyond excited to welcome. So I am going to bring in our guest first, the journalist and author Eric Marcus. He's the founder and host of the award-winning Making Gay History podcast, which mines decades-old audio archives to actually tell our stories. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Jean Marie. I'm so glad to be with you today.
Thank you. And also let's bring in the other Eric, because we needed to have two today. So Dr. Eric Cervini is an award-winning historian of LGBTQ politics, a New York Times bestselling author, and a Pulitzer Prize finalist for his first book, Thedeviance War, the Homosexual versus the United States of America, which everybody should definitely read. Hi, Eric.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
I am so excited that you are both here. For everybody who's watching, Eric and Eric got to see me nerd out and tell them that their two books are actually sort of bookends when it comes to my LGBTQ history, two of my very favorite things to look at. So we are going to talk about, first of all, the article that appeared in The Advocate, and it was about, in Missouri, an LGBTQ history exhibit actually being removed after there were some complaints about it. But I actually think that was not an isolated story. Recently, we know that Tennessee passed a bill that allows parents to opt their children out of any educational program that even mentions LGBTQ people. So why do you think it seems like it's more controversial than ever to talk about LGBTQ history? And maybe Eric Marcus, we can start with you.
Sure. And first I want to congratulate, I would call you Little Eric, except that you're a doctor. A Pulitzer Prize finalist. But I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with you because you are what I hoped would be the next generation, actually, or two generations behind, of young people who would be exploring our history in depth in a way that I didn't get to. So I learned so much from Eric's book. So I'm not surprised by what happened at all. I don't think it's necessarily a new wave, but as we become more bold in sharing our history, there will be pushback. There are people who think that we are dirty, disgusting creatures who hide under rocks. They still believe it. There's a small slice of the population that believes that. So they're going to push back. But what they've accomplished in this case is that they have so raised the profile of this exhibition in Missouri, which I don't think any of us would have known about, that it became a national story. So you could read about it in the New York Times. So, and it's the exhibit's available online. You can see it online. And I serve on the board of the American LGBTQ Plus Museum, which is a brand new museum. We're just launching and in formation. And I'm co-chair of the programming committee. We're probably going to do a program specifically about the Missouri exhibit. So this has been the case throughout our history of people pushing against us, and all it accomplishes is it brings more people out and it makes us more militant. At least that's my take on it. What do you think, Eric?
I completely agree. And first of all, thank you again for having me. It's such an honor to be here, especially having studied, the founding of PFLAG and everything that it does. I just can't express how grateful I am to everything you all do and all the parents out there who take part in really giving us family, a sense of family, because I think that's so important. And I have to say, Eric, it's always an honor to be on with you. So much of my studies, but also the book, was based on the conversations that Eric had, because a lot of the folks whom I was studying had passed away before I was even able to write the book. Because of the generosity and the insight of scholars like Eric, I was able to tell the story. So I can't thank you enough for helping out with that. And, I do agree. I think that because in some ways we are becoming more visible, because queer folks in particular are telling more and more of our own stories, there's going to be a little bit of a backlash. The more visible a persecuted group is, the more the opposing side, the oppressors, is going to try to keep them down. But as Eric knows, as anyone who's studied history knows, that's also how you build community and resistance, and that's how you create change. If it weren't for Dr. King provoking folks in the South, in Birmingham, in Montgomery, and elsewhere, there would not have been a confrontation that resulted in change. And so I think that's kind of what we're seeing here on a much smaller scale, but an important one, where we are becoming more visible, we're provoking a backlash, and now we're having this conversation, and we're being able to talk about the importance of queer history. So I think ultimately, even though the situation itself isn't ideal, hey, silver lining is we're having this conversation.
I think that's a great way to look at it. I kind of didn't even really think about, this has given us a whole different conversation to have, because now we can talk about why is this happening? And there are so many reasons. And I love the fact that we are now telling our own stories. It is not somebody else sort of generating the history for us. And I think that's pretty exciting. So whenever we get into conversations about LGBTQ history, I think one of the first things that we find ourselves going to is talking about the erasure of LGBTQ people throughout history, and how this has shown up in education. So I'd love to hear from both of you. What's lost when we don't get to tell these complete stories? I mean, we think about this a lot. And can you give some examples of where we've been able to restore some of these characters or some of the pieces of identity to people from history, and it's really given us a more comprehensive story of our past? And again, maybe Eric, Marcus, we can start with you.
It's a great question. It's a great question. That I take issue with the word erase, because that suggests that our history ever existed on the page.
That's true.
So our history wasn't even considered legitimate history. One of the battles I had with my publisher in 1992, when the book was first published, was the shelving information on the back of the book. I wanted it to say American history or American studies, and all they would put was gay interest. I wanted my book to be on the bookshelves for American history, and it wasn't considered even legitimate. So what's lost by not sharing these stories, by not knowing these stories, by keeping them hidden, are great stories. Just one in particular, Bayard Rustin, principal mentor to Dr. Martin Luther King and chief architect of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Now, if I had learned that story when I was in 11th grade American history, about how the FBI tried to blackmail Dr. King by suggesting he was having a relationship with Bayard Rustin, that's a great story. So much more interesting than the deracinated version of a lot of the history we're taught, or the Lavender Scare being taught concurrently with the Red Scare, so much, which is really the focus of so much of your work, Eric. They're great stories. And without these stories, we don't know our history. But it's not just our history, it's all history. It's almost all the history that's covered up. When I was in school, I learned about the heroic conquest of the West. Was there a mention of how the native populations were murdered? No. So I think this is such an interesting story to be told, so many stories to be told, and what's lost is the real humanity and the real the diversity of the stories of how we got to where we are today.
There's a class that we actually do at PFLAG, and we put on a slide up for everybody, and it has easily 2 or 3 different dozen historic figures, all who are LGBTQ identified. And whenever we ask how many of you were taught that these people were LGBTQ identified between, when you started school in maybe 12th grade, in any given class, we get almost nobody. And still, even when we're talking to younger people, they're still not hearing about it. So Eric, Cervini, can you talk a little bit more about this? It's very confusing today. Because I got to tell you, as I read your book, I thought I understood the Lavender Scare. I thought I knew Frank Kammeny's story. I knew nothing. I couldn't put the book down. So could you talk about how you see this?
Jean, let me just jump in for a second. Eric, did you send Jean Marie that letter, that cover letter that came along with your book?
I need to. I forgot about that.
Can you say what that cover letter is? Because I thought it was. I didn't think it was real. I thought it was a joke. It couldn't possibly have been real.
I'm intrigued.
When I sent copies of the book, and for people who don't know, that the book is called The DEVIANT'S War, and it's about the Lavender Scare, which was the systematic persecution of queer federal employees in the 50s and 60s during the McCarthy era. And very often, if you were a federal employee and you were found to be LGBT, then you would receive a letter saying that the federal government has uncovered information suggesting that you were a sexual deviant, therefore you have lost your job. That's what happened to Frank Kameny, to so many other early pioneers. And so when I sent the letter or the book to some of my heroes and scholars out there, it included a letter that informed Mr. Marcus that unfortunately there has been evidence uncovered that he may or may not be a homosexual. So it was quite fun.
I definitely want to see this letter.
Yeah, I'll find it. It did give at least 1 or 2 people a scare, but I probably should have made it a little less official looking. But no, I completely agree about the loss of story, and I think that's so much of what still needs to be done in telling our history, is not just telling the facts and the dates, but also the humanity. And I think that, in an unrelated note, in those stories, when we study history, we're also studying ourselves. We're learning about ourselves. When I was in high school, I was growing up in Central Texas in a town called Round Rock. I certainly didn't know anyone who was gay. I wasn't going to school with anyone who was gay. I had no template for what being gay meant. What is that identity? If I had studied Harvey Milk, Frank Kameny, Bayard Rustin, Marsha P. Johnson, anyone, if I had even learned their names, that would have told me, oh my gosh, there is an entire world out there. There's an entire family out there of people who are just waiting to accept me. There's a whole past out there waiting to be studied. And so, it really took, it was the film, and I'm in Los Angeles now because it was film. It was Hollywood. It was the movie Milk, about Harvey Milk, that turned on the light bulb. That made me say, wait a second, why was I not taught this story? And the second question was, what other stories are out there that must still exist? And so that's why I hope anyone watching, no matter how old you are, where you are in your life, what education you have the ability to tell these stories. And I think everyone can do it. There should be a queer history of Round Rock, Texas. And it doesn't matter who writes it, but someone should do that, not just to learn about their town, but to learn about themselves.
And every town and city in the country has its own LGBTQ history. And what is heartening to see is that there are various oral history projects around the country now for people to record stories. And that is one way of preserving the history. I had the good fortune to interview Jean Manford and Morty Manford, who are co-founders of what became PFLAG. And it turns out my mother co-founded the PFLAG chapter in Queens with Jean Manford and Danny Drum and others. I didn't know it because my mother, I only learned years after her death that she had done that, because she knew that I sometimes got annoyed with her for being more of an activist than I was. So
it's the PFLAG kid dilemma.
It is. At the 93 March on Washington, my mother had the PFLAG sash and all the buttons, and it's like, Ma, who's the gay one here? But I was very proud of her. But these are great. These are such great stories. And to know, we all know about PFLAG now, and I should say we all do, but many of us do. But actually, there's another point I had wanted to make about the importance of learning this history. And it's not just for LGBTQ people. Anecdotally, we know, or we think, that teaching this history is more effective in reducing bullying against LGBTQ kids than teaching kids not to bully. These kids know bullying is bad. It's like, so you teach them bullying is bad, don't do it. Yeah, well, you should know that already. Or your parents teach that. But if you learn that these are real people with a history and a sense of pride, it makes kids look differently. The straight kids look differently at the LGBTQ kids.
And I think for the LGBTQ kids, it's a sense of, I've always been here. There are people like me who have always been here, and now I'm here and I can do something too. It's this sense of quite literally being placed in the timeline.
Yes.
And I think that's what learning your history does. Suddenly you're visible, even though you didn't necessarily feel that way.
Yeah.
So one of my frustrations when we talk about history, and particularly LGBTQ history, is that it feels as though very many times this conversation starts with Stonewall. And I'm not saying that Stonewall wasn't important. It was obviously very important, but it is an incredible frustration to me. I have had people point blank say to me, oh, well, it all started there. And I'm like, no, it hasn't. So can we talk about this a little bit, about a few of those things that were happening before Stonewall that are so important, that are often being overlooked, and why we need to look to those things again? And I'm not even going to say which Eric should jump in first. I'm just going to let everybody go wild.
I'm going to defer to young Eric.
Young Eric the younger. I think that may actually be a real person. I understand why folks use Stonewall as the starting point, because it was, as you said, a foundational moment in our history. But as I like to say, it wasn't the moment that started everything. It was the moment that changed everything, right? Like any major event, whether it's the March on Washington, the Declaration of Independence, any major event, there is a history before and an after. And we have to look at it. That's our job as historians, is to place very, very important events in context. And so, of course, my book primarily looks at the decade before the Stonewall riots. And I think one of the most important reasons why you have to tell that story, or at least be cognizant of it, of that context, is because what was happening in the decade before Stonewall? It was the civil rights movement.
Yes.
Why did the Mattachine Society and other of these homophile organizations, as they were called, begin to march? Well, it was because they looked at the demonstrators in the South. They looked at the March on Washington. They attended the March on Washington, and they looked around and they said, why aren't we doing this? And so very soon, months later, you have Randy Wicker organizing his march in New York City in 1964. He may even be watching right now. He's very active on Facebook. And so I think it's important, but also looking at some of the mistakes that were made. And I think that's what the second reason why looking at not just Stonewall and after, but looking at what went wrong in the decade before Stonewall that made Stonewall so important. So when you look at those demonstrators, they're almost, with some exceptions, like Ernestine Eppinger, who Eric and I both love fanboying about, they're mostly white, almost entirely. And so we have to ask ourselves, okay, what went wrong then? And then what that makes us do is look around ourselves now and say, who am I organizing with? Who's in my social circles, in my gay community, or in my community of allies? What is the racial composition of my group? What can I do to be really not just a better ally to the LGBT community, but the intersection of the Black community, people of color, and the LGBT community? And I think that's especially true after the events of last year.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Eric, you mentioned Ernestine Eppinger, who's better known to most people as Ernestine Eckstein.
Yes.
She was made famous by two things. There was a couple of pictures in front of the White House of the protests in 1965, and there is a lone Black woman wearing white framed cat's eye sunglasses, and her hair is done up in a chignon hairstyle, Audrey Hepburn-like, white blouse, black skirt, and pumps. She was also featured on the cover of one of the issues of the Ladder, the lesbian magazine, in 1966, she was the first Black woman to be featured on the cover of the Ladder, and at considerable risk because she could have lost her job if someone actually recognized her. So I had wanted to interview her, couldn't find her in 1988, 89 when I was doing my work. She had left the movement by the late 60s and moved to California to get involved in the Black feminist movement because she was very frustrated with the homophile movement, that it wasn't moving quickly enough. her niece wrote to me 3 weeks ago.
No way.
Yes, her niece discovered the Making Gay History podcast episode with Ernestine. She'd wondered who was her aunt. She never met her. She disappeared from the family. She left Indiana, moved to New York, and she was curious who she was and was stunned and thrilled to find out that her aunt played this pivotal role in the homophile movement. And it turns out that Ernestine had good reason to leave Indiana and go and find her own life elsewhere because her parents were Muslim and very close to Malcolm X. So, yeah, exactly. Wow. So what I love about the work we do, that Eric and I do, is that you never know when people are going to come out of the woodwork and broaden the history. There's a young man who just did an article for the New Yorker on this book club in the 1950s. You saw that, Eric, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it actually had big implications in terms of the organizing around Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis and One Magazine. Just to follow up on what Eric was saying about the importance of knowing about that past movement before Stonewall, I was so sick of Stonewall by the time I started my book in 1988 that I thought I would put it in its rightful place, but I played it down even more than I needed to. But I just felt like it sucked the air out of the room. And if you didn't understand what came before, you couldn't understand the organizing that came after. The first meeting held after the Stonewall Uprising to channel this energy was organized by the president of the New York chapter of Mattachine Society and the New York chapter of the Daughters of Bilitis. So if that structure hadn't existed, what came after would not have happened. So it's a pivotal event. It's an important event to study, but I think we wind up spending too much time on it because it's a very easy point to look at and say, this is the beginning, or this is the beginning of the modern gay rights movement. Like saying that the Black Civil Rights movement was Rosa Parks, Dr. Martin Luther King, and done.
Right.
So I always forget I shouldn't talk with my hands on these calls because I wind up waving in front of the camera. Sorry about that, but I get very excited about this history.
You know, and I get so excited when I see people starting to give nods to the pre-Stonewall stuff. I know that when I was watching the reboot of Tales of the City and they started referring to Compton's cafeteria, I was actually cheering out loud because it had been something that we were teaching, because to me it was so important, and the work that Susan Stryker did on that was so important. And yet no one knew what it was. And it just absolutely shocked me. And when you tell the story, you just see people's eyes get so wide and so excited. And it feels like people start diving then. So this actually, and you both kind of queued up beautifully the last thing that I think we're probably going to have some time to talk about, which is we are talking about teaching history. And one of the big focuses of these conversations broadly, not just in this space, has been bringing back more diversity into the conversation, recognizing that the contributions weren't all the white gay men, not that there's anything wrong with that, that often get covered, but there were so many people of color, so many women, so many people who were not gay, people who were bi, people who were trans, people who had different identities. So can you talk a little bit, and again, I'm going to let either Eric jump in, and I refuse to say younger or older. I'm not going there. I refuse to participate in that. But
I'm sorry. I started something bad. I'm very sorry. Forgive me, please.
No, because then I'm going to have to ask for forgiveness too, because you're going to be like Jean Marie, the older. So can either of you talk about some of those figures and people who you think those who are watching today probably should be looking into, some of those names that don't get mentioned enough? I know that we talked about Marsha P. Johnson, and she has certainly gotten a lot more attention recently. But can we bring up a few more of those names?
Sure. Well, I think you can't talk about Marsha without also talking about Sylvia and Sylvia Rivera. And, you know, I think there has been a resurgence of interest in her. And I think what's so exciting about a lot of you know, the discussion online and a lot of the depictions of her is recognizing that, you know, kind of going back to the last question, yes, those riots were important. Yes, they were there. But what happened after was also incredibly important. So looking not just at the before, but what happened after? Well, Sylvia and Marsha joined the Gay Activists Alliance, right? That was one of the organizations that popped up after Stonewall because it had such a galvanizing effect on the community. And what happened when they tried to organize, whether it was demonstrations or events or donations for the trans community, or especially trans folks experiencing homelessness, they were refused. over and over and over again, they were kept off the stage. This is what happened in 1973. I'd suggest everyone look up Sylvia Rivera 1973 Pride and her speech, where she was not allowed on the stage at Pride because she was, quote unquote, a drag queen that made the queer community look lesser. And so seeing what happened next, how she was essentially exiled from the movement because simply of her, not just her trans identity, but I would argue her intersectional identity as a Latina trans woman. It shows us what we need to be cognizant of now and how we need to be vigilant about how we're making space for folks like Sylvia and Marcia, folks like Ernestine, where, you know, as you said, so much of history does center on white men. And that's true in queer history as well, even if they're gay white men like us, right, Eric? And so I think it's our job as those guys who've been benefiting from what I would say is an injustice to make that right, to do that work as a historian, to not just unearth those stories, but also to elevate others who are unearthing those stories and telling them.
It's very challenging in the early years. I don't know what your experience, Eric, was of the research during those years. Most of the people involved in the movement were white. The majority were male. So trying to unearth who was there, like Ernestine, who is one of the very visible people, is challenging. And I only heard Ernestine's voice for the first time when we discovered a 1965 interview, a recording that was buried in the bowels of the New York Public Library. It was conducted by Barbara Giddings and Kayla Husen. And we're fortunate to have that recording because otherwise we would not know her voice. She was interviewed, and there was an article that was printed about that interview, but not her voice. So the challenge for us and I'm not a trained historian, I'm a citizen historian. The challenge is to unearth these stories and find people. Wasn't easy when I was doing my book in '88 to elevate the stories of people whose voices had not been heard. Because often we focus on people who made huge change. And for example, featured an interview with a guy named Wendell Sayers. He was in his mid-80s, African-American, lived in Denver. Very little involvement in the movement, but hearing about his experience of being gay and then trying to get involved a little bit in the movement and how dangerous it was for him gives us insight into what his life was like at that time. So it's possible to find those stories, but it's very, very challenging.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that Sylvia Rivera got mentioned. I remember reading about her getting involved with Gay Activists Alliance and how that went. And I thought, wow, at the time we were, when I was learning a little bit more about that, we were talking about trans inclusion and ENDA, when ENDA was ENDA. And I thought how far this story went back and how we could see where this went off the rails very, very early. It just makes you feel there's a responsibility to get it right now. Because we saw where it didn't go as it should. So yeah, we have 3 minutes left. And the one question I think I would like to ask you both is, as you see more states, I think there are 4 of them now, that are actually mandating that LGBTQ history and figures get included in curriculum. Does this give you hope, or do you think we still have a long road to go on this kind of inclusion? And is that enough?
I'll say very quickly, gives me hope, and it gives me hope, and I'm very excited about it. The whole country of Scotland is now required to include LGBTQ history and education. So, I mean, this is just an extraordinary move, but what complicates it, you can't just dump this information on educators. They haven't learned this history either, and they're, for the most part, very nervous about teaching it. They're afraid about pushback. So professional development with educators is essential when rolling out this material. So I think there's an enormous opportunity for all of us working in this space to be of help. And I look forward to continuing to bring LGBTQ history into the American history curriculum in classrooms across the country.
Right. I completely agree. And I think it's about giving resources as well to teach that history, because of course, if Texas is mandating a certain textbook style, that's going to affect the entire country. And if queer folks aren't included, that's going to affect the entire country. So it's up to us and legislators, whether in Missouri or Texas or California, to provide those resources to teachers. And fortunately, so many of them do exist, like Eric's podcast. And so I'm just so grateful for all the work he does and that y'all do. And thanks again for having us.
Just one final thought. What I find is that the students themselves are driving this, the kids. They are outraged that they're not learning this history. There's enough of it out there that they can go to their teachers and say, why aren't we learning this? We want to learn it.
I love that level of outrage too. What a great way to turn energy and anger into something big. But it's because of the work that both of you are doing that a lot of this is able to happen, and we can get things into people's hands that they need. So I'm so grateful to both of you. And I want to thank you so much for joining us here today. And I hope that you will come back and we will get to keep talking about this very soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, everybody, I wish I had more time. Really, I could have gone much longer on that one, as we say every week. But we will be back next week with another great conversation. We're actually also going to be talking about history again, just a different aspect of it. We close the same way every single week. We remind you to run fast, to laugh hard, and most of all, be kind. And if you haven't done it yet, please, please, please get vaccinated so we can all be together again sometime soon. My name is June Marie Nevada. We will be back next week. But until then, if you need any help, visit us at pflag.org for assistance. Thanks, everybody. Bye.